Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Brad Feek. I'm with the EstesGroup, and really excited to talk to you today. Today's subject, what is professional service as a service? This is for us something that's been an ongoing question in terms of how to build business processes and solutions that help our customers and meet their specific needs. And so we thought, what better way to do that than to have a conversation about that today? So my partners in the conversation today are Bill McCord, EstesGroup's VP of Services, and Nate Hood, Estes VP of Sales. And between the three of us, we will dive deep into the idea of how service models are being applied to the area of professional services. So with that, let's talk a little bit about just what the traditional service delivery models are like. In ERP professional services, I've been myself in the ERP world for 20 or more years. And I guess I would say that I've seen a lot of models. Most of them have the same basic structure. And I would say ERP professional services, whether you're talking about very large projects or even some of the smaller projects out there, a lot of them have a lot of the same characteristics. And one is they're very consulting oriented. They're very much oriented around having a single, threaded individual with a specific skill set working directly with the customer to complete a project. Maybe you have multiple consultants working on that project together. But what they mostly are working on is some sort of fixed scope project. Now that scope varies greatly from project to project. A small project or a large one, something that's very complex and labor intensive, something that's not nearly as complex potentially, depending on the industry or the system being implemented. You have a lot of scope differences from project to project. They tend to be real contract based. They have like a fixed bid large project version, or you have a time and materials ad hoc version. Those really are the two flavors you have in these cases. And most often you're billing out your work. You're working a week, you're entering a timesheet, and your information, your report on that week, your status report, and the billing on this subject is normally working in a traditional weekly billing model. So you do some work, you get a bill for it. As a customer, you get this bill. Now you have to decide, does this work all make sense? Did I get what I paid for? Go through invoicing, etc. One interesting kind of traditional delivery model that's different than the ERP, I would say, is that of managed IT services. So in managed IT, it's much more technical support oriented, as opposed to your consultant being the tip of the spear in terms of like services. The service tip of the spear is the IT technician. Quite often the services provided are repeatable. They have a fixed scope. Something that can be very easily defined and quite similar from customer to customer. They tend to be subscription based. They are things where you might want something that's repeatably done as opposed to a single project, and thus it's something that fits itself to a subscription model. And quite often that subscription is monthly in nature, such that you get a monthly bill. The bill that you get is something that is expected because you've already worked out that service contract, and it's quite a different model than the traditional ERP service model. Now, why do I ask that? And the reason for that is that this is kind of really fundamental to EstesGroup's own story. Estes, we began as a professional ERP service-oriented consultancy. We were implementing projects, doing large implementation projects, smaller ad hoc optimization and fine-tuning projects. That was our bread and butter for the longest time. And over time, we found ourselves, this was basically due to customer requests. Customers were coming to us saying, we have a broader set of needs that go beyond the ERP system. Can you help us with those? So we started developing what are now, what I understand to be called managed IT services. This was our foray some 5+ years ago into managed IT service delivery. And for me, this was the first time that these business models became something that I was aware of. And we started managing, incorporating these managed IT processes. And we discovered there was quite a bit of difference between professional services and managed services. And that for us was kind of eye-opening, that these two different areas had so many differences to them. And one interesting thought that came out of that was there was a lot to like about the managed service process in terms of the challenges that it avoided by creating these repeatable cycles and these modular sets of delivery of solutions for our customers. So we started to look at offering professional services in a manner that was more like that of traditional managed IT services. And Bill, you came to Estes now several years ago. And when you came, we were still very much in our infancy and trying to figure out how to work our two business lines together, the professional services, the ERP consultancy side, and the managed IT side. What were some of your observations regarding these two areas when you joined the company?
The single biggest thing that stuck out to me is and you've touched on this a couple of times, although you haven't used these words. It was really two different organizations under one umbrella, right? I mean, although working for the same ownership and things like that, it really was, when I first got here, it was ran as two separate companies. And you and I started talking long ago about unifying those and seeing if we couldn't find a way to take existing processes that were being developed on the managed services side and work the professional services support elements into those same processes. And it was a fascinating conversation. I remember it vividly, and I'm glad that we've taken the time to continue to work through that problem to the point where our customers now get one experience instead of two different experiences, depending on what their needs were when they called in. Yeah, to me, that we've made tremendous strides in terms of streamlining the organization, and more importantly, delivering a better experience, of a more consistent experience for our customer base.
Right. I think that idea of, and I see that with a lot of consultancies that have added MSP, that tends to be one of the big challenges, how to make that seamless to the customer. And I do remember that conversation. I believe I was driving to a conference across America from Wisconsin to Texas, which was a ridiculous thing to do in an SUV. But that said, there's been, I'd say, a broader shift in the industry towards what we might call service-based models. That is, services that have been traditionally very ad hoc based. And these are both services and truly products that, items that we've often bought and consumed as an individual discrete entity are now subscribed to. I use the idea you might have seen on our first thumbnail here, the idea of hot dog Netflix and Netflix. How do those two things come together? Well, Netflix is kind of one of the great examples of a service-oriented model for the delivery of content that previously was quite often very insular and kind of ad hoc in its delivery. I'd like to think of traditional business model being the pay-per-view event. You want to go see a UFC event, you pay for that one event. Now, what you can do instead is the UFC and other industries have subscription services where you subscribe to their service, and that includes all of the above. So if you have something that you really want to consume in great amount, rather than buying things in individual instances, now Netflix and similar models have created an environment where you can subscribe. I don't know if I'd want to subscribe to hot dogs myself. I could see that getting very big over time. But from a vendor perspective, I mean, one of the question would be, why is it that service models have become so pervasive? And from a vendor standpoint, I probably think, and of course, we could all say, yeah, vendors like it because it works better for them. That may be the case in some cases, at least. But I think there are other kind of macro factors that have been out there that have fostered the world that we're in. One would definitely be technology improvements in computing, storage, network, et cetera, things that allow businesses to connect in ways that when I first entered the IT world really weren't. In the IT world, you were a company, you were insular, you were self-contained, and the kind of service models we see now really weren't a possibility. Similarly, once that infrastructure laid it out, software was now available to do that technology. Remember when Netflix was still delivering DVDs, right? I'm sure they had a vision into the future of that service model that would be delivering product over the realm, but their original subscriptions were actually in the delivery of physical product. And again, rental of services, rental of products allowed for a different way of looking at the delivery of entertainment. Communication technologies, I think, in the service area specifically, have made things much easier to accomplish collaborative activities from outside companies' own network, to be sure. Definitely economies of scale work out there as companies build data centers and they have repositories of their own data center. They are also building economies of skill in that by solving these problems for their own organizations. I think of Amazon as probably the best example, where they created their own internal architecture for the deployment and hosting of any of their services. They realized at some point that one of their greatest internal assets was truly an asset that they could turn and make customer facing. So Amazon Web Services and that whole line of business came from that basic idea of let's take this economy of scale and let's use that to help a broader range of customers. And out of all that came an idea of repeatability. If you're building, I remember Bill Gates, or not Bill Gates, who's Dr. Evil at Amazon? His name escaped. Jeff Bezos had that famous letter he sent to his entire development staff that you will do everything in a certain structure. Everything will communicate through a service. Everything will be built for maintainability and repeatability. And anybody who doesn't do that will be fired. It was kind of classic Dr. Evil language. But what it led to was a world where your solved problem now could be something that you scale up and sell to others. Now, Nate, why don't you give me coming from sales, why don't you give me the customer's perspective as to the underlying shift to service-based models?
Sure. And to kind of lean into your Netflix, pay-per-view analogy, it kind of parallels. I remember having a bunch of buddies over for a Mike Tyson fight, and it was, $35-40, and it was over in about 11 seconds. And so that's kind of the disappointment that the old style break and fix service delivery model emulated, right? You have a problem, and you call up your old buddy Nate, and he sends a guy over right away, friend of Bill's, and they get the problem fixed, and they come along with an invoice. So every time you see Nate, immediately you're thinking, oh, here comes another invoice, and that doesn't make you like Nate very much for sure. So what customers asked for was a way to solve problems that was, primarily more flexible. It gave them access to a broader set of talents and skills because, ultimately, customers have gotten more technically savvy and are able to solve, everybody can replace their own printer cartridge now. Everybody can plug I don't want to give away industry secrets here, but they now know to unplug it and plug it back in, right? Wait 5 seconds, 8 seconds, the opinion varies there. So the problems are a lot more complex, and therefore the demand for a solution that is more adaptable becomes really necessary. Scalability is another thing that customers quickly saw a need for, whether it's, seasonal demand requiring increased capacity or simply, the seasons of growth that ebb and wane as, businesses deal with what happens in the marketplace. So the ability to quickly bring large numbers of resources to bear is something that's tough to do without a little help. And then predictability, I think, is huge as well, not just in the way things are done or standardization, but, every business fights with their accounting folks all the time, and accounting folks loved getting a water bill and a power bill that was very consistent. We saw utility companies go to level billing a long time ago. That IT guy, on the other hand, was very much up and down, and that didn't make anybody in the accounting department happy. So this service-based, shift was brought about by their desire to have ultimately an IT bill that they could predict. They could plug that into their P&L and know what they could expect to spend over time.
And that said, let's go ahead and define just what professional service as a service is. So we talk about it quite often as a delivery model. That is, you take these specialized services, you provide them in a way that's scalable, it's subscription-like, and it operates in kind of an on-demand format. It involves a lot of things. For one, outsourcing the expertise to meet specific business needs that you might have as a company, without committing to the long-term in-house resources. Now, on the previous slide, we talked about the skill conundrum. You have a broad array of needs within an organization, but you can only hire 2 IT people inside of your team to take care of all those needs. Now, how do you get all of those needs fulfilled? Well, if you're lucky, you have really skilled people who want to stay with the company and do all those tasks. We find at times those people are in certain markets hard to find, and they might be expensive to find. So customers come to us looking for those broad skill sets, those really diverse skill sets to help build that. So if you were looking at what's the key features of professional service as a service, really some of the keys: subscription-based, it moves from contracts to an unpredictable cost, or it moves away from like single contracts with unpredictable costs to much more clearly defined, well-scoped and predictable accounts. It's tailored for individual organizations. And that's really, I think, a thing we'll hear a lot in terms of flexibility, tailorability, scalability, the ability of building a solution set that meets a customer's needs that can be pretty broad, or you might have just a few needs depending on where your skill gaps are. This methodology tends to be pretty flexible to do that. Nate, talk a little bit about the tailorability and flexibility that you've seen over time with some of our customers.
Yeah, I think that's probably the most important thing to think about when you're kind of defining this is it's almost impossible to hire a guy or a team of guys that can anticipate, every need that you're going to have. And what happens, and Bill and I have seen this a lot of times, you find the sharpest guy in the marketplace, bring him in to head up your IT team, and on day one, man, he's still very much in touch with what's going on outside your company, and he's got a view to the rest of the world, and then he puts on your company blinders, and now he's in your environment and your model, and he's focused only on your business and things that he does on a day-to-day basis, and he kind of loses sight of what's going on in the rest of the IT world. So the advantage here is when things crop up that aren't, part of his day-to-day activities. They're all smart guys now. You can waste a half a day Googling around finding an answer, or you can leverage an extension of your team, and that's what this is intended to be. To say the easy button that used to be in I think it was the Office Depot commercials, being able to quickly solve a problem and having access to folks who have encountered this specific problem before is a huge deal. So it gives you a tremendous amount of flexibility and the ability to leverage a team much larger than you could if you had to pay them all full time, right?
Right. No, that makes a lot of sense. So what I've seen in the past, one way of kind of talking about professional service as a service from a customer standpoint might be you might approach it from a benefit analysis. You also might approach it from like the use cases that drive a specific PSaaS adoption. When I think of one very common one, it has to do with staffing. We have customers that are in a situation where they've lost a specific resource and they need, for a period of time, perhaps a prolonged period of time, to try and address those. Say they have an ERP developer, they might have someone on the business side, someone like an analyst, a support analyst. Maybe they have a system administrator who's administering the application and doing those kinds of semi-server, semi-application tasks, a tweener person. They need someone there to step in and fill that gap immediately. Another area that I've seen that's been pretty common is the idea of and this is probably an overused term, core competencies, where there are specific skill sets that are a drag on the overall organization. They're hard to find, or they're very expensive, or they're infrequent. You have someone who needs to manage your shipping bolt-on, and it needs to be tweaked every couple of months or a couple times a year. You may not be able to find someone to hire permanently just to do that thing. So you might have certain skills that you want to offload so that your team is focusing on a specific area. And maybe a subset of that is kind of the overflow area. You might be a company that's doing a lot of work on your system in terms of implementing new modules, developing new ports, fine-tuning, automating business processes, and you want some assistance with those big needs while you yourself focus on new initiatives, new buildings, new site construction, et cetera. You might be focused on more immediate tasks. And these set of skills here are things that you can use overflow support. So what I see, what customers sometimes do, they come to us and have those challenges. And they tell me a little bit. We had a customer who was kind of out in the middle of the hills, and they had lost several resources at one. What did we do in that case?
Yeah, so we work with a lot of companies in manufacturing and distribution, and many of those places aren't, in downtown, as it were. A lot of them tend to be in outlying areas. We had one particular customer who was in kind of rural Kentucky, and they lost the guy who was there at the time they implemented their ERP. He had a ton of tribal knowledge, and many of the processes that they had were built around the way that he thought would be the best way to skin the cat, as it may be. And unfortunately, people age out, people get other job offers, people have career changes. I think this guy ran off to a hippie commune or something to be a therapist. Who knows? But at the end of the day, the customer was left with that huge hole where the guy who answered all the hard questions and knew where all the bodies were buried and understood their business the best was now no longer part of the organization, and no one else there really had a deep and thorough understanding of the ERP system itself, why it worked the way it worked or how it worked the way it worked, and even their own internal processes they were a little blind to because they just did it the way Larry always did it. You know what I mean? And so they came to us and said, "Hey, we really need somebody to take a look at what we have. In the near term, we need them to take on Larry's role, and be able to fill that gap between the business need and how we solve that problem in our software. And then long term, we need somebody to help us understand kind of our own processes, why Larry did what he did, and even help us find, the next Larry. The challenge there was there weren't many guys with that knowledge in their geographic area, so they knew they had, a long runway to find somebody that was a good fit or talk them into moving to rural Kentucky, which is a sales job I sure wouldn't want. But anyway, at the end of the day, we were able to fill that gap for them immediately, and then provide for them, a extra layer of support in a service model that worked for them until they were able to locate a replacement.
Nice. And Bill, the idea with core competencies comes that idea of skill set specificity and the ability to be both a specialist and a generalist. And when you're working with a team of people to address those, there's kind of some special dynamics there. Tell us a little bit about how your team members' skill sets get honed over our entire customer base.
Oh, we could make a whole webinar out of this one, all in of itself. Generally speaking, I, when I'm looking for a tech, a dev, regardless, one of the things I'm looking for is a good, solid understanding that troubleshooting skills are separate from application level skills or any other skill. Somebody who has a real well-defined set of troubleshooting skills can get through just about anything. Nate sort of referred to it earlier with the Googling around for hours, although that's not exactly how this works. But the fundamental is that they understand not only something's wrong, but where that something should be, and can start to drill in from that using their years of logic development and things like that. I'm sorry, guys, I'm vapor locking here. I'm gonna pass.
No worries. No worries.
No, I think Bill kind of
No thought there.
The way I got it explained to me is it's not so much now guys who can do things, which it was when I was first getting into the workforce, but now it's guys who can connect the dots between things and solve problems based on experience. And kind of back to what I was saying earlier, once a guy goes to work for you, his scope of experience becomes very limited really quickly and much more focused because he's looking only at your company And if you have the opportunity to look at a bigger, broader team, and I think this is where, not to wax salesy here, but I think one of our advantages is you get a bunch of guys solving a bunch of problems in a short span of time for a bunch of different customers. And what that does is turns them into, just Jedi masters of problem solving. And so now they know a lot and they're able to apply it in a different way across a lot more issues.
Yeah, they do develop it. I think you've nailed it. And this is where I was having a difficult time building a bridge a second ago. They're developing at 30 to 50 times the rate of, say, somebody who works for a single manufacturer out in the middle of Arkansas, for example. They're exposed to our teams are exposed to so much more on a daily basis than any other kind of environment would expose them to.
Yeah, I was
Right.
just trying to make up for the Googling comment. I didn't want that to, leave a stain.
when I interview a new employee or a new candidate, one of the big things I tell them, and that's always kind of a key, I think, with our hiring process, is when you're talking to someone, are you someone who likes to address a broad array of issues and be able to connect those dots from one customer to another? I think for us, that's a real exciting place to be, and I like our team for that. That we have guys who like to jump in and address issues, and then from there, as those team member skill sets grow, you can move from one area to another. And that's important because when you look at professional service as a service, there's a lot of things that could be included within a PSaaS contract. And we found different customers having very different needs. Now, RIP Richard Simmons, man, close to my own heart, especially for that hair. Richard Simmons back in the 90s or the 80s had this program called Deal a Meal, where you had different foods that you were allowed to eat. So you dealt out your meal and you controlled your diet that way. And for me, I've always felt like service selection within the idea of professional service as a service really has a feel to that, because some customers don't like Brussels sprouts and some customers are vegan. And depending on what customer you're dealing with, you can deal the specific meal to them in terms of what a contract might look like. And what we've seen in the past from a breadth of work, we see stuff going all the way from kind of start at the deepest level server support. We see folks using our services to help their ERP servers stay up and running, make sure that they're not getting overloaded, that the temp DB is not getting pegged out, that the system itself, its RAM and stuff is getting released properly, that if you have to be rebooting the servers on a schedule, that schedule is happening and maintained, to moving kind of a little closer to the application side. We see folks in what I had called that ERP administrator role, guys who are doing user administration, security, maintenance of recurring tasks like MRP, responsible for troubleshooting processes, performance issues. If you have performance issues hurting your company, quite often the ERP admin's kind of the focal point to that. We see folks who come to us looking for that quite often because ERP administrators are kind of a special breed of worker, and we don't see a lot of them regenerating themselves. It doesn't seem like that's a place where new IT employees are going to. So when we get folks coming to us, sometimes it's because their ERP admin has recently retired or is scheduled to retire. One area that is kind of an interesting way of taking small projects and bundling them into your overall world is the upgrades. So upgrades are short activities, but they're pretty well defined. They're pretty small in general, especially if you're talking point releases. I know there are some of us who came from Epicor 905 and had to migrate from 905 to E10 in the Epicor Kinetic field, and that was a monumental activity. We see now some folks in the Kinetic world are migrating to the whole Kinetic user interface, and that itself can be pretty significant. But what we've seen works well is some customers come to us, they're like, we want a very distinct service solution where you keep us up to date, and we want that to be part of the process. So we function from there. We see a lot of folks in the end user support realm. Nate's example of the rural Kentucky example of losing their application administration and business support. for the end users was really big, because if you don't have someone who's kind of first contact with the end user to help them when they run into unexpected issues, that's an area where we see a fair bit of need at times. Kind of a similar role, but a little bit different, is the business analyst. For larger companies, you might have specific business analysts who are scoping out solutions for the techs to do, and also generating reports in their free time. Quite often we see that roles to need some help. We've even seen with consulting that, and this probably overlaps with end user support, the ability to deploy and provide traditional functional application support for ERP processes, such that they can rely on someone to always be available to jump in and help walk them through an area. If a new employee needs training in a specific area, or if an employee is trying to implement a new module within the ERP system, expand their usage of a system, you have someone that you can pull in. And then certainly custom solution support is an area where folks have come out, and they want the system to work better and be more tailored to their business, but they don't have resources to make good, successful custom solutions to address those needs. That's definitely kind of one area. So as you can see, there's a real broad array of all the potential things that might be fitting for a given organization based on the needs. And really, it's a matter of kind of dealing out those appropriate items. And to that end, one question you might be asking is just how do you initiate this whole support here? Nate, why don't you talk to us a little bit about the assessment and the subscription setup phases of a professional service as a service?
So this is something that we had to be very purposefully intentional about. The deal with professional services as a service, if it is to work as intended, is it has to be an iterative process, right? So the first step is to spend some time really digging in with the customer beyond just the obvious surface needs. And sometimes the conversation goes, yeah, Larry left, and here's the 8 things that Larry did. He ran help desk, and he did this, and he solved this, and he did these 8 things. But the real truth is, Larry was involved at a much deeper level. So we need to emulate that. We need to dig in and do a very thorough look at the business, kind of go from cradle to cash and understand the process, and look for all the places where this might make sense. Now, to stick with your Richard Simmons analogy there, and listen, I would have gone Burger King where you can have it your way, but I'll adhere to Richard Simmons too. That's probably healthier. So
it's not on my diet. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So, at the end of the day, it's kind of like, I don't know, when you got your first iPhone, and you said, well, what does it do? Well, everything, sorta, right? The possibilities are pretty broad, but at the end of the day, it only does the things that you need it to. So I need a phone. I need to be able to take pictures of my kids, occasionally get a text or whatever, but a lot of the other functions I don't need, and maybe you don't either. I think the burden is on us and the customer to communicate really well at the onset, do a thorough examination of what their needs are, and then figure out what we think is the most likely suspect for an agreement, at least a good pencil drawing of how we might come together. And once that's done, there's the step or the requirement that we have a good circle of feedback going to ensure that it continues to be a great fit. Businesses change and grow. We need to change and grow with you. A couple of years ago, a lot of my customers experienced some kind of weird national pandemic or something, and their businesses shrunk almost overnight, and we needed to be flexible in that way too. So I think it's key that we continue to talk and continue to work towards making sure that the service is an ideal fit.
Very good. And Bill, why don't you talk a little bit about the ongoing support process? Once sales has gone ahead and put that together, and now you deploy the service delivery team. Tell me about that process a little bit, how that works.
Yeah, absolutely. So in most all cases, we'll assign some sort of a PM to meet on a regular basis and figure out exactly what the work is that needs to be done. And then that PM will work with our dispatch team to get the appropriate engineer, tech, dev, whatever the case, involved in the effort. And then that cycles through over and over again, depending on the workload. We've got one customer, for example, that has in fact, we have several customers really that have regular ongoing meetings, and Matt, one of our developers, is operating in a PM capacity at this one particular customer. And he's got lots of history with them, so he understands their systems well. And it was the rightest fit for them to get him involved in their weekly development meetings and to pull out list of activities that we can get accomplished for them. So to your point earlier, it really is kind of built on a customer by customer basis, and so far it's a system that's worked really well.
Mm-hmm. That said, I think it's always a good idea to also identify when something won't work well, when something won't be a good means of addressing the problems you have. Because I don't like the idea of believing that something is a solution to all that might bother you. And definitely, I think there are places where professional service as a service isn't an optimal fit. Now, what I've seen in the past, I would say large projects tend to be a challenging thing for professional service as a service, a service-based model, a subscription model to work really well. Now, I've seen several ERP vendors in the past try to release ERP implementation as a service, and it ultimately results in a project being cut up in terms of its billing over a fixed period of time, right? You have a 9-month project. You take that service model, you cut it up, and now it's billing. So that's really more of a billing model than it is a service model. So sometimes we take as a service, and really it's just trying to find a different way to get the customer to pay for it. So I don't think that's really a great place for that. I think fixed scope implementations are similarly can be quite challenging here. And this is, I would say, a fair bit of work we get is when a customer went through a canned methodology and ended up live and implemented without knowing really what they did and knowing the system very well, because some of those methodologies, they can be very skinny, which is great for costs, but what you end up with on the final end is you have a system that you don't really understand and know how to optimize. We find ourselves jumping in there at times to do tweaking optimization projects with those customers because of that. So I think I have some hesitancy personally about having fixed scope implementations, again, because one of the benefits of this model is its tailorability. And in a model where you're much more kind of held to very tight rails, it gets very hard to help the customer as you need and provide all the service that you need. I think the scalability and tailorability is really important to this business model. And when you have something that is so fixed in nature, that can be challenged. In terms of our customer base and our conversations, we have some customers that just have no needs. They implemented the system very much in an out-of-the-box manner. Perhaps the system was a really good fit to their business and everything they did, and they didn't find a great need to further optimize and try to fine-tune the system because the system really mapped onto what they did. So they don't just have a whole lot of needs come up that would demand this level of support. Kind of on the other side, I've seen customers that have very large IT departments, and they're able to buy all those resources to cover all of their needs. And at times their needs might actually overstrip the demand that's for them. So in those cases, obviously, this isn't a great position for them unless you find an organization that's looking to turn over a new leaf and reinvent a certain department. Sometimes we run into that where a company gets bought out and now the new owner is looking to scale down cost, and by doing that, looking to replace some of that legacy staffing with a team here. But if you're in an organization that's not in that boat and you have all the people you need, this might not be the thing for you. I would say companies with really short-term needs. Say you have here's a good example. You're upgrading your E10 classic user eye interface in the EpiCore ERP system, and you're migrating it to their web UI. So you have a very short set of activities you're going to do maybe over a month's time to get from point A to point B. And when you are at your final point, there's really no need for you now to look at have something else ongoing. You really just need some services for that time period. This is where that might not be the best area there. Really kind of the inverse of that. If you have needs that don't have a very clear finish line, I think professional service as a service really works to address those kinds of needs. If you have something that is ongoing nature, doesn't have that kind of definite cutoff point. All right, so Nate, why don't you tell us a little bit about why ERP users tend to go in this direction from your own experience?
I think, and again, the professional service as a service idea can handle a lot of different things, right? But traditional help desk, things that you would have done on a break fix basis in the past, security, all of those places, this type of agreement works well. But if I had to pick an area where it works best, it's in the ERP system. And there are a bunch of big reasons that it makes sense for customers. We talked earlier about the idea of how hard it is for somebody to know everything. That's especially true in the ERP area. A lot of these things, people don't change business rules every day. People don't add third-party integrations or bolt-ons every day. It's a one-off thing. People definitely don't do ERP conversions, every day. Many of them may not see one or two in their entire career. So being able to tap guys who have, slayed this specific dragon before is of tremendous value. And Bill's got some guys on his team. I say all the time, there's not a lot of junior Jedis over there, but rather there are guys that have been dealing with these things longer than I've been driving a car. I mean, they're pretty, vintage guys. So, absolutely, more than you could hope to as far as an expansion of your own team's skills. The next thing is predictability from a cost standpoint. Goes back to, like we said earlier, keeping the accounting folks happy. If you have ongoing needs, on a continuous basis, it's a whole lot easier to access the percentage of resources that you need on a level basis. Of course, we can, like we said, grow that or shrink that as we need to over time. But a lot of times when you go out to hire, a specialist in something like the ERP field, you don't really need 100% of that guy's time. You need 60% or 80% of that guy, and the other 20 to 40% he spends, drinking coffee in the break room and causing problems around the office. So if you can get just the amount of that guy you need, it really helps contain costs as well. The other three, I think, all fall into a similar category, and that is it just makes it more efficient when you can pick and choose from a menu of what your real needs are, align a team in an agreement with those so that you always have what you need and you're never stuck. Back in olden days when you would go to refresh your server infrastructure, you had to pull out your crystal ball and figure out, oh man, what am I going to need in terms of resources 5 years from now? And this solves that problem, right? You can look at your needs today from a staffing standpoint and a skill set standpoint, and know that if they change, which they certainly will, over the next 6 months, 8 months, 5 years, whatever it may be, that you have a relationship in place with guys that are already familiar with your business, that are already acting as an extension of your team, that you can just, reach over and turn the knob up or down another notch or two and be exactly where you need to be. So I like to say from an IT administrator standpoint, if your title is director of IT or IT leader in a company, this is a great way to become a hero in a pretty easy format. So.
Sure. And Bill, when we were talking earlier, you gave me this great example of a customer who came to us from another provider who was really just going down rabbit holes. Can you expand a little bit on that?
I sure can. So, and this is one of our largest hosting customer slash partners. It's the situation was they had another MSP who and we see this a lot, right? Consultants and and others. They want to kind of hold on to the perimeter. They feel like that's their zone, and if they let it go, then they have somehow given up some of their power. And this was one of those cases, right? The MSP that was in there doing support for them would build them black box after black box for the problems that the customer brought to that MSP. Um, and and ultimately the customer became very frustrated because every next iteration, every next black box that was brought to the table meant yet another mystery that they had no idea what was going on inside of, right? They didn't understand what it did. They didn't understand how to support it. They didn't understand, how to care and feed it, all those kinds of things. And this guy felt like he was um, building in job protection, if you will, or job security through his delivery of these black boxes. But ultimately, it did not end well for him. And so they came to us and asked us to not only to take over everything that this former guy was handling, but to unravel and teach them what every black box was. So over the course of the next year and a half, because it took a while to work through all of the mystery meat that was accumulated, we were able to eventually get them to the point where their own internal IT staff could support themselves in ways that they couldn't before, and they've been immensely grateful. We still partner today. We're still their hosting support. We're still their ERP support and things like that. But they have their own internal staff now that is growing and maturing and supporting, and they no longer have black boxes.
Right. I think that's one key point of this kind of service is that you're not building it to build a new fiefdom, but rather you're building that so that it can be decoupled if that becomes appropriate, because no engagement lasts forever. And should you have that situation where the customer, for whatever reason, maybe they make a new hire and have someone who can step in, fill that role. Maybe they've learned it internally and can reassume that. I think part of that flexibility and scalability is the ability to scale down should that come. And part of that really comes with the ability to not build it so that you're building yourself down a rabbit hole. I like that. And for those of you here, we're not going to spend too much time reading through this slide here. I really liked this one when I was putting this together, and I fall in love with words, unfortunately, and type too many of them. So if you were going to screenshot a slide, this would probably be the best one to do. And this is really, for me, just the intriguing point as we've come to learn more and more about this business model, this delivery model, the differences specifically about how you've always been doing things as a service delivery partner and how it works within a PSaaS world, how scalability or your team structure, what your overall value proposition might be, and how those might differ from one area to another. And going through those differences, I find might be a good way for a customer to try to understand, is this something I want to pursue, or am I in a good place already? And to that, we are nearing the end of our presentation. I want to thank everyone for attending. I want to thank, of course, Bill and Nate for your involved here. If you have any questions or any comments, by all means, there are features there in the webinar to fire those out. This would be a great time to hit us on there. Nate, why don't we take this just for a second here to talk a little bit about our own professional service as a service offering in the ERP space. We call it EstesCare ERP. Why don't you give us a bit of a rundown?
Yeah, so this is the answer to what customers asked us for a long time, and like I said earlier, there are a bunch of different flavors of it, including things like security, including things like ERP support, and all just the traditional IT tasks that may fall, in the category of, man, I sure hate doing that. We can absolutely take those things on. And the idea being that there is, an EstesCare agreement for just about every need that's out there. And if there's not, then we'd love to have a conversation about what one might look like. I think the one thing that I would want folks to take away from this is, if there are things, in your business that you feel like gosh, if I could just get this off my plate, I could free up my team to go and do this. I could be a lot more proactive if I wasn't doing these maintenance tasks. Or, gosh, this is something that I'm only going to ever have to look at. Occasionally I wish I had that easy button on my desk. Then let's have a chat. Let's talk through what your needs are and see if we can figure out, a way to make it work for both of us. And that's part of the conversation, right? One of the things that we try to build into all these agreements is the idea that we're going to continuously circle back to have a conversation and make sure that it stays a good fit both ways, right? I don't want one of these agreements to choke us to death, and I don't want one of my customers to get their invoice and go, man, I don't feel like I got the value out of that this month that I'm spending here. We always want it to feel like it's an excellent fit for both your needs and budget.
Nice. Very good. Well, so if you have any questions, a little bit of time we have left, we'll hit a couple of panel discussion points here. Nate or Bill, in the conversation of avoiding black boxes, we've leveraged IT glue as a key area in our business as a communication tool. Can you tell me a little bit about how the use of IT glue can help a company who's in this service area avoid that kind of black box knowledge?
Yeah, so IT glue is just one component of what I'm essentially referring to as a culture of documentation, right? So at the end of the day, the harsh reality is that our customers pay us for documentation is a product as much as it is a necessary item for future reference, right? I mean, it not only should it be an education tool, but it is a deliverable to the customer. And when we complete something, we need to make sure. And I'm just going to use replacing a cert as an example, right? I mean, you go out and you buy a cert, and then you go and you reference that cert on all the servers that need to reference that cert. Well, if you miss one, inevitably that's going to be downtime, and to hunt, that particular one out could take. I've seen it take hours to find which server, service, whatever was looking for that cert and couldn't find it. So the whole point of documentation culture is to make sure that we are getting all of these things down in such a way that we avoid the catastrophe that is awaiting us otherwise. Um, and with IT glue, we call it something else internally, but with IT glue, it gives us a chance to consolidate those notes into one cohesive place. And it's become such a monster at this point. I mean, we've instilled this culture over the last 3 years, and it's become such a monster that we now use AI to sort through those documentation, sort through all that documentation, to pull up answers instead of the standard search functions. It's gotten that massive.
Yeah, I think that's really a neat area. Dig a little bit more into that in terms of how AI and training up an AI agent and then exposing it to teams through chatbots and such can help provide very unique customer specific and ERP system specific support.
Well, Brad, we actually did a whole nother webinar on how this AI integration works. So I definitely recommend, if you have some time, you go out and check those out. But essentially, what we're doing is we're taking all of that documentation and throwing it into an AI bot, if it's we'll leave it in simple terms, and letting that AI bot kind of sort through and sift and figure out what all's there, and it does its magic. And then we have another comp bot, a bot that is essentially looking for what can and cannot be talked about, and so that polices the first bot. So when we ask through Teams, and we've connected our AI bot directly to Teams, so we can actually chat and interact with it that way. So when we interact with our chat bot, the police bot will pay attention to what's being asked, and it gives permission to the source bot to be able to go out and answer that question or not, depending on whether or not it qualifies as something that needs to be answered. But it's an interesting venture into AI and what we can do with it. This particular one was an internal effort that we started 5-6 months ago, and have brought it a long way. So I definitely, again, recommend going and watching that AI chat with myself and Matt from the EstesGroup.
Nice. Now, Nate, one question I think sometimes comes up with regard to these service contracts, and that's the question of underutilization or overuse, kind of two sides of the same coin. Can you talk through that challenge and what we do to try to mitigate it?
Yeah, absolutely, Brad. And I touched on it briefly earlier, but the idea that these be an ongoing conversation, and part of the responsibility is on us, and we do that. I love to go to a customer and say, "Hey, we solved 35 issues for you last month as part of your agreement." Sometimes, we have to go to a customer and say, "Hey, you called us 80 times a day for the last 25 days. You're killing us a little bit. Let's find a way to make this better." If it's end user training to deal with, recurring problems in your environment or something like that, then that can be a great solution. If it's, rescoping the agreement, then certainly we're open to that. But two, it's both of our responsibility to make sure that, things aren't underutilized. So as we add new capabilities, it's on us to make sure that our customers are aware of that, as well as to, to stay in that mindset of, let's make sure this is always a good fit. Because, things change, people change, needs within a business certainly do. And Bill, I hear you loud and clear. The AI thing is creating changes for a bunch of folks. And so as we discover new ways to solve problems, I think it's important that we continuously stay in communication. We may have exactly the right agreement in place on day one, and 3 months later, we need to do something a little different. What's enabled us to be successful with these professional services and service agreements is the idea that we're going to continue to tailor it to be a perfect fit for your needs and budget on an ongoing basis for the life of the agreement.
Very nice. And with that, as our time here is running out, I want to thank everybody for attending today. If you have any questions, we have our information up there. You can always send an email to our sales team if you have any questions, or you can visit us on our website. And I want to thank Bill and Nate for your time today. And if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out, and have yourself a great afternoon.